Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, 1 year after Edward Snowden exposed the spying at the NSA, can the internet be reset? Egypt, and one of the best-known bloggers from Tahrir Square is now a convicted criminal looking at 15 years in jail. British Muslims and the media there. It's not paranoia if they really are out to get you. And keeping up with the beautiful game. A nice little video to help kick off the World Cup in Brazil. On June 6th, the world's second biggest mobile phone company, Vodafone, produced a detailed report on governments in 29 countries spying on its customers' phones. That happened the day after the one-year anniversary of the first Edward Snowden NSA story. Snowden blew the whistle on the National Security Agency's appetite for spying on phones and emails. His revelations outraged many Americans, including members of Congress who drew up a law designed to rein in intelligence agencies. America has 18 of them. But pushback from the security establishment meant the bill that eventually passed was watered down to such an extent that privacy advocates dismissed it as a sham. Google and Facebook are among the heavy hitters who are now in on this debate. There's a campaign called Reset the Net, pushing for an internet that's safer from government snooping. Until that happens, journalists are among those who, over the past year, have started encrypting their communications, fearing for their professional safety or just trying to preserve the anonymity of their sources. That's just one of the tangible effects the Snowden story has had. There are many others. Our starting point this week is Moscow. It took Edward Snowden almost a full year to agree to be interviewed by a major American news outlet.
He is routinely called the most wanted man in the world.
NBC News went to him in Moscow because Snowden is trapped in exile. It was the first extended interview with the whistleblower the Obama administration calls an American traitor.
What are you doing in Russia?
The United States government decided to revoke my passport. So when people ask, why are you in Russia? I say, please, ask the State Department.
I think it's incredibly important for people to see not just the documents, but the person who made the decision to leak them.
If we want to be free, we can't become subject to surveillance. We can't give away our privacy. We can't give away our rights.
And to see that this doesn't seem like a conspiracy theorist or some kind of fringe person, but a thoughtful, ordinary person who is reporting his sincere concerns.
He doesn't come off as strident or self-aggrandizing. He's extremely humble. You really get the feeling that this is someone who faced a difficult moral dilemma and made a clear, coherent choice.
There are some things worth dying for, and I think the country is one of them.
Who Snowden is has helped the media understand the role that leaks and whistleblowers can have in our political process.
At infiltration.
Snowden even helped his interviewer better understand his own phones.
What can the NSA do with this device if they wanted to get into my life?
Any intelligence service in the world that has significant funding and a real technological research team can own that phone the minute it connects to their network.
Before Edward Snowden dropped his bombshell last year, if mobile phone companies were uneasy about the NSA and other intelligence agencies sweeping up their data, they kept those concerns to themselves. That's over. Vodafone unofficially marked the Snowden anniversary by writing a 40,000-word report, publishing it online, and exposing 29 governments that are wired to eavesdrop on anyone using Vodafone's network.
The Vodafone report explicitly refers to the Snowden leak, so there's no doubt that they've timed the release of it to meet that anniversary. The private sector has to work within the parameters of national law, and they have to cooperate with governments where the law obliges them to. But they're realizing that doing so is jeopardizing their relationship with their customers.
A year ago, before the Snowden revelations, I don't think there's any way a company like Vodafone would have taken this step of being so public. The Snowden revelations have injected a kind of courage and spirit of transparency and sparked an open discussion that's made it possible for companies like Vodafone to start coming forward and being more transparent with the public.
Within 2 months of the Snowden leaks, President Obama formed a presidential panel to look into and reform NSA surveillance, which his Secretary of State John Kerry would later admit had reached too far. And a new law was brought before Congress, the USA Freedom Act. The original version would have ended mass surveillance and reformed the secret courts that merely rubber-stamped what intelligence agencies had asked them for. The bill that eventually passed Congress, what was left of it, was more of a tweak. Instead of outlawing mass surveillance, it creates a new set of what are called specific surveillance authorities that are supposed to tie surveillance requests by the NSA or any intelligence agency to more specific threats.
And the problem is it's not clear exactly how meaningful that is or what it even means. A specific selection term like a phone number, could you just take a phone directory and say, here are our selection terms? Could you take a list of hundreds of email addresses, is our specific selector? Without clarification about what that means with respect to different technologies, it's not clear that this really ends bulk collection in anything except the most indiscriminate sense.
Call them skeptical, call them tech-savvy, but many Americans and web users around the world did not wait for the government spying on them to come up with a solution. They've changed the way they communicate, journalists included.
One of the really important things to come out of this, out of the Snowden leaks, was a realization by people that online communication is not private. Whispering in someone's ear is private, but anything that you do online, email or online shopping or social networking, is very much public communication, and people need to be aware of that.
The NSA, while in many ways it's weak on mass surveillance, when it comes to targeted surveillance, it is a formidable opponent, and they will be able to hack anyone, whether it's a foreign leader, a journalist. So journalists doing very, very high-level controversial work need to be aware of that, and I think journalists do need to get informed and take steps to protect themselves.
There are several news organizations right now that are using software called SecureDrop that lets sources communicate securely with journalists. If anything, SecureDrop is a user-friendly method for sources to use the deep web to communicate with journalists. And so the Intercept runs SecureDrop, and so does Guardian and ProPublica and other news organizations.
I've certainly walked more than a few of my journalist friends through installing email encryption tools or the Tor browser. And I think journalists are increasingly realizing that it is, in a way, part of their ethical obligation to be knowledgeable about this for the sources who aren't Edward Snowden, but you're not using good encryption technology and anonymity technology. You are failing in your ethical obligations as a journalist either way, as much as if you were just giving your source away.
There's more sources out there with really big stories, and they're going to find the journalists that both that they trust and that also know how to protect them. When you go to the journalist's page and you see their PGP fingerprint, and you see that they're running SecureDrop, I think that sources are more likely to contact those journalists and those news organizations.
We have to be careful about the suggestion that the private sector is going to provide some kind of technological fix to this, encryption tools or privacy tools. Because really what we end up with then is just a kind of race. Encryption tools get better and decryption tools get better, and that's not really a solution to this. The solution is to talk about what it is we expect from this and how we want to see this governed in the future.
That's the theory, but in practice, the U.S. Congress has rejected a law that would have ended mass surveillance in favor of one that doesn't. One American court called the spying Orwellian and almost certainly unconstitutional, but another court disagreed. And the White House admits reforms are needed, but still calls the man who exposed the problem a traitor. As long as that continues, more and more people will be Googling terms like encryption, Tor, and SecureDrop. And Edward Snowden will remain in exile, watching the debate from a distance and making the occasional salient point.
How can it be said that this harmed the country when all three branches of government have made reforms as a result of it?
Our Global Village voice is now on the surveillance story, 1 year after it first made news.
Tech giants are finally reacting, and yet the future they paint is about more mass data collection, not less. Smart watches, augmented reality glasses, self-driving cars, and connected homes are what these companies still imagine as an essential element of our future societies. Snowden managed to question their practices and behaviors, but not their dreams, their utopia.
One of the most interesting aspects of what's happened since Snowden's revelations a year ago has been how the corporates, the big internet giants, have reacted to it. Some of their reaction has been very good, some of their reaction has been less good. The less good things have been the way that they have tried to make it look as if surveillance by corporations is totally different from surveillance by the NSA and GCHQ. If there's anything we should learn from Snowden, it's that the two things are intrinsically linked, and what we want from the corporates is for them to protect us not only against the intrusion by the NSA, but against privacy invasive techniques used by corporates, including themselves.
Time now for Listening Post Newsbites. Alaa Abdel Fattah is a name you may remember from 2011 and Tahrir Square. He is one of Egypt's best-known bloggers and rose to prominence in the revolution that brought down Hosni Mubarak. He's just been sentenced to 15 years in prison. The jail term is for assaulting a policeman. Fattah and 24 other defendants were all convicted after stealing a policeman's walkie-talkie at a demonstration last November called to protest the interim military government. The mass sentencing comes just days after the swearing-in of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who has vowed to return Egypt to stability and urged media bosses during his election campaign against pushing for freedom of the press. 4 Al Jazeera employees remain behind bars in Egypt, with a verdict expected soon in the case of the state versus 3 journalists from Al Jazeera English. The showdown between GEO-TV in Pakistan and the ISI, the National Intelligence Service, has knocked GEO off the air, and it's not getting back on until it pays a fine of about $150,000 US. This is all fallout from the shooting of a GEO-TV anchor, Hamid Mir, about 2 months back. Mir survived that attack but blamed it on the ISI, which had criticized his reporting. GEO-TV did not pull any punches in its coverage of the Mir shooting. The ISI, which denies the allegation, then took the case to the Pakistani media regulator, which took GEO off the air for 2 weeks and levied the fine. GEO was already effectively blacked out in many parts of the country, having been dropped from most cable networks. Its parent company, Jung, now says it's suing the ISI for defamation after the spy agency described the company as anti-state. The Bureau of Counterterrorism at the U.S. State Department wants to take the propaganda fight to Boko Haram by launching a television channel in the rebel group's stronghold, northern Nigeria. The channel will be called Arewa 24, which means North 24. Washington has reportedly earmarked $6 million for its launch. The State Department has acknowledged that the project could prove challenging, since Boko Haram has been known to target media organizations it disapproves of. Washington already funds an Arabic-language television channel called Al Huda, as well as Radio Sawa across the Arab world, and Radio Fardo in Iran, which has been blocked by the government there. We've reported before on the impact 9/11 had on media discourse in the U.S. and the way that American Muslims and their religion have been covered by news outlets there, often with fear and suspicion. In 2005, Britain had the 7/7 attacks, which also affected the media in the UK. Read the British press, and not just the tabloids, or go online, and there are some scary stories about Muslims. The most recent being one on a supposed secret Islamic plot to radicalize school students in Birmingham. There's a steady stream of reports on Muslim women and whether they should be covered or not, Sharia law, as well as a recent story on what's being called the surreptitious serving of halal meat to unsuspecting Britons. Is the UK, as reflected through its media, Islamophobic? Or is this just a case of a community growing and the news media failing to cover them accurately? The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on Islam and the British media.
Here are the figures. In 2001, a UK census showed that there were 1.5 million Muslims living in Britain. 10 years later, that figure grew to 2.7 million, up by 80%. So inevitably, there would be more news coverage about Muslims. But what would you consider to be a proportionate increase? According to research conducted by the University of Birmingham, in the decade preceding 2006, news coverage relating to Muslims and Islam in British national newspapers increased by 270%. That is more than 3 times the population growth rate. And the study concluded that 91% of those stories were negative. Flip through the papers today, and not much has changed.
Within the last 6 months, you've had from Muslims attending a theme park labelled as hate preachers and extremists. The niqab debate keeps coming back around and around again. The halal was another issue. Trojan horse plot, Muslim schools. When you look at these series of stories, it's putting the spotlight on a very small minority.
For example, if we look at the niqab and the wearing of the niqab, it's likely that less than 1% of British Muslim women actually wear the niqab. And yet when we see the image of Muslim women in the newspapers, I would say around 99% are actually wearing the niqab. So what we see is this gross distortion of the reality, the construction of fear that becomes apparent in the media.
The idea that the British media is in any way Islamophobic, that is to say, fearful or loathing of Muslims, is absolutely ludicrous. What it is an attempt to understand a growing dynamic in Britain. As they exert their numbers, as they now move into education and other areas, it is the job of the media to try and help people who are already here to understand them. It's not fear, it's trying to comprehend and understand.
And according to Engage, a Muslim advocacy group in the UK, they are failing. In 2011, Lord Justice Leveson set up an inquiry into the culture, practices and ethics of the British press following the News of the World phone hacking scandal. Engage took the opportunity to raise the issue of Islamophobia in the country's media. And according to Lord Justice Leveson's final report, the inquiry heard sufficient evidence to conclude that some sections of the press have deliberately invented stories with no factual basis in order to satisfy demands of readership, and that one publication in particular, the Daily Star, published stories about Muslim issues knowing that they were untrue. But misinformation is only part of the problem. It can also be the framing of stories. In 2012, 9 men were convicted of sexually exploiting young girls in Rochdale in northwest England, with similar cases around the country.
All involving mainly British Pakistanis.
Who were all Asian.
Mainly Pakistani Muslim men groomed.
The critics say that as soon as it emerged that the grooming gangs were Asian and Muslim and that their victims were white, that the men's race and religion became central to their offences in the coverage that followed.
That again falls back on this idea that you essentialise religion. You're making religion the reason for those crimes. And I think if you looked at any of the profiles of the men that were implicated in these cases, they were drug abusers, they were alcohol abusers. Very few of them would fit the profile of what a British Muslim would consider a British Muslim way of life.
If we look at kind of other instances of paedophilia where, statistics show that actually it's mainly a white, middle-aged man who's actually the perpetrator of this. We don't talk about this being a white crime or a white phenomena, but if Muslims are involved, that actually comes to the forefront. So we always talk about Muslim grooming.
But what you have to remember in this case is that evidence was put before the court in Britain that the reason these men preyed on mostly white girls, I'm not saying this is true, I hasten to add, but that what was heard in court was they preyed on white girls because they saw them as cheap, easy and available, and they would never do it with their own Muslim girls. That is why their faith became important. If counsel says that in a court, it has to be covered. I would argue to my journalistic dying breath, it is germane to the story if that's what drove the men to choose vulnerable white girls.
Journalists are often under pressure to get across a lot of information with, in the case of print, as few words as possible, or for broadcasters, as little time as possible. One of the ways they do that is to use journalistic shorthand. And when you look at the coverage of Islamic issues in Britain, certain words, adjectives keep coming up. Terminology that has broad implications, but is short on meaning.
Everything has an IST, so you've got jihadist, Salafist, Islamist. It just feeds into the language in terms of allowing those right-wing journalists their own definition of people, which is a negative definition, and classifying them so that it's easier for their readers to understand that this is exactly who we're talking about. So if, for example, if you call an Islamist here and you call the Muslim Brotherhood Islamist in Egypt, then they're the same people.
It's never just the word Muslim or Islam which is used. So there's always these appellations with it. So it'll be radical Muslim or mainstream Muslim. There's always this demarcation between good and bad. There's always this idea being reinforced that actually not all Muslims are good. So even if there's a good story, they will be referred to as moderate Muslims or mainstream Muslims.
Last month, The Guardian's Nazreen Malik said that there is a cycle of Islamic scare stories that keep resurfacing in the British media. The question is why?
I've been a journalist for probably more than 3 decades, maybe 4 decades, I don't know. All stories are on a cycle. And here's a classic example. In Britain, sometimes we love to do stories about dogs biting children. I don't know why, but in Britain we like these stories. A Rottweiler will bite a child, and these bites are probably going on all the time, but by God, for 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, the newspapers are full of Rottweilers biting children. The reality is, it's selling. It's selling newspapers, it's getting discussion on radio shows like mine, it's making TV bulletins, so suddenly it's in cycle. It's the same, without being offensive, I'm not likening them of course to animals, but it's the same sort of thing with Muslims. Suddenly the stories are in vogue.
Causality is a really difficult thing. To suggest that media output necessarily has led to certain changes in society or certain shifts in the way in which Muslims are treated. One of the lasting consequences of media output after 7/7 has been the construction of the entire community as complicit in some of these crimes. And whereas ordinarily you might have identified minorities within that community as part of the problem, certainly in the construction of the war on terror, that you're finding huge majorities of Muslim communities that are now come in for that level of exceptionalisation.
We should have a space where we can actually disagree and debate and contest and challenge. I don't think that's Islamophobia at all. I think where we see that Islamophobia begins to emerge is that when those disagreements or dislikes or criticisms are then used to, sort of homogenously to criticise all Muslims without differentiation, to kind of demonise the religion of Islam unfairly, to encourage hatred or bigotry and even encourage violence. I think that is when it becomes a problem.
British Muslims are a minority, but the majority of news stories about them are negative. Some journalists say they are just trying to, quote, understand the Muslim community. Others say they are merely reflecting society and its attitudes. But take a longer look behind the headlines and those attitudes. That's the real story.
More Global Village Voices now on the way the Muslim story is reported in Great Britain.
There is a tendency to depict Muslims and Islam as a religion in a frightening way. The problem is that what you can see also since 7/7 and since 9/11, there is a lack of differentiating between the extremist and the mainstream. Unfortunately, what's happening is that these very rare extremist cases are depicted as representing the whole Muslim community, and that is what makes the relation between Muslims and non-Muslims more problematic.
Where is the religion of the EDL supporters? Where is the religion of those that kill their wives and children at home in Hackney, for example? But a family kills their daughter in broad daylight in Pakistan in front of the court, and it's immediately seen as caused by Islam. Why is there a difference in the reporting of these stories? That's what I would like to know. I think the British media need to wake up to the damage they are causing.
Finally, with the World Cup underway, we scoured the web for an appropriate video. Some big advertisers are throwing a lot of money at this tournament, but we decided to go with something on a smaller scale. This little film follows a Montreal-based filmmaker, Guillaume Blanchet, freestyling with his football around the globe. It's just a boy and his ball, and he's got skills that would turn a Brazilian head or two. Not that the Canadians have qualified for the tournament. We almost never do. The film's called Bounce. We've made it our web video of the week, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
What? Okay. Remember back in the days, we used to play all day, sit back, talk a lot of nonsense, don't it feel like yesterday? Yeah, don't you feel like fooling around? Let's shower under cloud, let's make love under the sky. Oh, what a high.
Recherchons deux suspects, homme blanc, pull orange et un ballon.
Kick back like the worlds you play, y'all.